Right. Okay. We are on recording mode, so let me reiterate that our agenda today is to discuss two of Derozio's sonnets, to the Roznigundha and to my pupils at Hindu College. And having done that, to initiate a few concluding remarks on Derozio's position as an Indian poet writing in English and his legacy to Indian modernity at large and the Bengal Renaissance in particular. Right. So let us take a quick look at to the Roznigundha. Sorry, once again. Derozio begins. I'm sorry, it's a little. What do I call it? A little small in size, but then you can take a look at it quickly. I'll read it once. The fragrance comes from my heart as where a love-breathed sigh from bashful maiden fair. Now, it's interesting, both Rozinka Chaudhary and Makran Paranjpe point out Derozio's unabashed commitment to the local. Now, we've seen this already in the way in which he has persistently talked about India as his own native land, one. Secondly, in his treatment of the Fakir of Jangira, Jangira's topography, the entire legend of the Shashan, the references to the Surya, the references to the local flora and the fauna. So, working within the tradition of the Orientalist poetry of Romanticism, Derozio very clearly pushes a new idiom where the local is foregrounded in terms of its flora, its fauna, and also not only its flora and its fauna, but also in its capacity to reach out to a global audience. Now, what this means, I'll explain when I reach the last lines of this sonnet. But the first thing that I would like to comment on here is Derozio's unabashed commitment to the local. To the Roznigundha is a poem that I choose primarily because this is one of its kind in Indian writing in English. Right. So, thy fragrance comes upon my heart as where a love-breathed sigh from a bashful maiden fair. So, while Derozio has taken the subject of the Roznigundha, you see, the idiom that he's writing in largely is of the romantic sonnet, is reference to the love-breathed sigh from a bashful maiden fair. But the focus here is not on the flower as itself, but the focus is largely on the fragrance that it radiates, right? The scent that emerges from the Rajnigandha. So swift, so sweet, so soft. My inmost raptured sense of bounteous nature feels the omnipotence. So it's a kind of presence of the Rajnigandha throughout his being. And if we extend it metonymically, then the Roznigundha is part for the whole, in the sense that it replaces or it is part for the whole of India, the nation, as it were. Right? Therefore, my inmost raptured sense of bounteous nature feels the omnipotence. So, me and you, me and thou, poet and Rajnigandha are welded together in a sense of feeling. And this feeling, if we extend it, is between the poet and the nation. So if you substitute Rajnigandha for the nation, for Indianness, as it were, for the presence of the local, then my inmost raptured sense feels the omnipotence, feels thou omnipotence. So it's this identification with India, Indianness, Indian topography, Indian flora and fauna that is infusing, I would say, a new idiom in Indian English poetry. Thou art like goodness, by the cold world's eye, unseen, unfelt. Now, if we read this a little more politically, then this is a reference to the world ignoring India, it being recognized as a fallen nation, something which has withered away. So, the cold world's eye, unseen, unfelt. But the poet recognizes, thou art like goodness, and therefore I sing of thee, and therefore I carry your fragrance. So ultimately, it is the Roznigundha which is important as a symbol of local Indianness. It is equally, you see, Derozio who is important, the poet who can convey this local identity into the world, as it were. Sorry. Right. Thou art like goodness, by the cold world's eye, unseen, unfelt, while breezes pass thee by, receiving a rich boon from thy sweet breast. Right. Once again, if you look at it very carefully, there are three images working here. One is the image of the Roznigundha, of course, which is bashful, which is a slightly shy. Then there's this concept of the cold world's eye. So the breeze, the cold world's eye, and very importantly, the poet. So it is the poet's, as it were, responsibility to not only feel this breeze, but also to convey it and to radiate it to the world at large. An odor like the breath of angels blessed, thus like petitioners, they wake up the sigh of incense pure from gentle charity. So the Roznigundha is here associated with gentle charity, right? Radiating out its goodness to the world at large. And thereby, somewhere, the Roznigundha is also, in many ways, fragile. It requires, because if you look at it, Rater Rojonigandha, Bhore, it becomes stale. The fresh Roznigundha flower, it becomes stale in the morning. Now, it's interesting that, the Roznigundha is fragile. It requires the poet's intervention to radiate its fragrance to the outer world. That from her home in shades, unseen, unknown. Once again, now try and change this perspective. Now don't see Roznigundha as merely the symbol of the Indian nation. If we now extend it and see Roznigundha as a symbol of a new kind of poetry that Derozio is trying to write, a transcultural poetry. Transculturation is a process in the contact zone, as Mary Louise Pratt writes, whereby the language of the superior power is utilized to create an autoethnographic rendition which uses the idioms of the power, but then fashions it in its own way. So Derozio has taken the moment in the contact zone. He has utilized the idiom of the romantic sonnet, but he's fashioning a response about the unseen, unknown Roznigundha, which, if you extend it to Indian poetry in English, will now find greater global acceptance. So Derozio is seeing himself as the poet who will allow the fragrance of this new Roznigundha, the Indian poetry in English, not the Indian poetry, mind you, right? Because Derozio has not taken a very conventional flower. He's not taken the rose. He's not taken, the champak odor, as it were. He's taken the Roznigundha, which is bashful, which is new, which is shy, which therefore needs the poet's intervention to create this breeze, or let the breeze waft into more prominence. So that from our home in shades unseen, unknown. Now let me quickly get back to one of Derozio's lines where he had written about the Indian poetry. And writing about Indian poetry, Derozio had actually added, and this is in the India Gazette, writing as Juvenis, and I'm quoting, "Why is that literature does not flourish in this country?" He's probably referring to Indian writing in English. He's not referring to literature in the truest sense of the wider sense of the term. "Is the soil or the climate uncongenial to the culture of so delicate a flower? Or is there a paucity of those talents which are necessary to accelerate its growth?" Now, many of you who are critical might immediately ask me a question, and it's a valid question. Isn't Derozio falling into the trap that the Anglicists had put, especially people like Macaulay, who had suggested that an entire library of Indian literature would be equal to a shelf of English literature? The Derozio is arguing that modern literature in India does not have the power, does not have this capacity, and therefore it requires introspection. Why there is no great efflorescent literature? You'll remember that there is a certain amount of Orientalist projection here. Derozio suggests that there is nothing comparable to the Meghdut or Kalidasa, the great poet, and that the modern Bangla or the modern Indian literature is impoverished, right? And this is something that, incidentally, Michael Madhusudan Datta would also try and address little later on. But there is something that withers in spite of every effort and every care. What it is, I have never yet satisfactorily ascertained. So, in that sense, Derozio is trying to craft a new idiom for Indian writing, this Indian literature, which from shades unseen, unknown, bestows her bounties, blessed by those alone who feel their influence. It's interesting. You see, Derozio's commitment to the local suggests that this literature about India can be written only by those who feel their influence. But having once felt their influence, the world never knows where and for whom the flower of sweetness blows. But having felt that, it is now the flower's fragrance that must radiate outwards. So, what Derozio is suggesting is that the fragrance of the Roznigundha is so important because it must now waft outwards to the world at large, rather than being restricted within itself. See, it's very interesting that Derozio's suggestion is that a flower becomes potent, or its existence becomes valid only and only when it blooms, and when it blooms and provides its beauty and its fragrance to the outer world. Thereby, Derozio is trying to suggest that this Roznigundha is emblematic of a new poetry written in English that must radiate out to the world and make its position within that universe. So there's an universalism, a cosmopolitanism in this poetry. At the same time, it is based on a very local on the local realities rather than drawing its realities from external sources or external imaginations. Thirdly, these realities are not available to all and sundry, but they are available, as Derozio points out, to blessed by those alone who feel their influence. So this is where I would say some of the most foundational elements of Indian poetry are created, that it is produced by people who reside in India and are conscious of the Indian realities, one. Two, it creates a new idiom by borrowing from the realities around itself. And third, that it is not merely meant for local consumption, but a global, broader, cosmopolitan consumption in reaching out to the entire world. Now, as you can see, this is a very complex moment where within the contact zone, Derozio is claiming a transcultural identity for himself. Where is the difference between Derozio and the later English poets? Is that in terms of language. Derozio is still borrowing the language, the form, and many of the idioms of romantic poetry written in English. Now, this will be reiterated throughout the century. If you're reading Manmohan Ghosh, you're reading Rishi Aurobindo, and to a certain extent, if you're reading also Rabindranath, they do not break free from the shackle of the romantic lyric as such. It is only with Nissim Ezekiel and the later poets that you have newer idioms, influx of Indian English words, contexts, and an attempt to create a language of their own. Derozio, in the first half of Indian writing in English, is creating his own realities. But his language and his style is largely still borrowed from Western poetic conventions. But remember, this is Indian poetry at its nascent stage. And Derozio is making a few markers for it. That one, it must reflect Indian realities and local specific identities. Two, it will be written by people who are Indians and who have the insight into Indian realities. And thirdly, that Indian poetry in English is not merely for a domestic consumption, but its breeze must always waft and mix with the broader global realities. At this point of time, India is, of course, impoverished and not powerful. But once Indian literature gains traction, then it will radiate out to a broader world. And this is where you need to place Derozio as placed within that first moments of the contact zone, creating transcultural autoethnographic representations that seek to carve a niche not only in local literatures, but also as a global phenomenon. And this is where I will see Derozio as part of this alternative nationalist project. Now, if there is one nationalist project vis-a-vis literature, which sees only Hindu identities and Hindu texts and falls back upon Indian classical texts, then Derozio is crafting another Indian modernity and nationalism that is local and cosmopolitan at the same time, that uses local realities but seeks to reach out to a more cosmopolitan audience and thereby carve a niche for itself within a global canon of literature. Right. So that is where I think the sonnet to Roznigundha becomes important. I have circulated an essay by Manu Chandar, which has very perceptive lines on the Roznigundha. You will find this in one of the mails that I sent containing the essay. If you have not received it, let me know after the class. I will send it once again. Right. That is Roznigundha, and half an hour has already passed. So let me come back to the next essay that I am going to discuss very briefly, the next poem rather. And this is a sonnet to my pupils at Presidency College. Just excuse me for a moment. I need to plug my charger here. Just give me a moment. I'm sorry for this interruption. Right. Okay. Otherwise, critical moment and I'll be out of charge. Now, this poem is written in 1829, was written in 1829, initialed as D, and written, and the date and place was indicated as HC July 1829. You'll find the details here, right? All the details I'm reading from actually Rozinka's book. HC July 1829, HC probably meaning Hindu College. Now, as I've said, Young Bengal movement crystallized around Derozio, and around him he gathered together a group of young students. Now the entire energy of the Young Bengal movement, as you will have noticed, was projected on a rational reading of every single reality, including religion, and a rejection if it failed the rational test. It also created a sense of brotherhood, and as many people have pointed out, it created a tradition of the Guru Shishya Parampara. So Derozio became the guru around whom the disciples would gather, and beyond the hours of the class, they would carry on their discussions at Derozio's residence in Lower Circular Road. Therefore, arguments were fierce. There was a serious degree of openness, a challenge to established authority, especially critical challenge to the Hindu religion, especially in terms of its rituals and its dogmatic practices. An importance on education. This was a very important part of the Young Bengal movement. Education as a panacea. Education as something which kindled rationality, and that rationality would therefore critically investigate all tradition. And if it was found wanting, it would be rejected. There were suggestions of atheism. Skepticism was definitely present. There was a challenge against established authority, including the British government, and therefore an atmosphere of fierce debate centered around Derozio. Let us look at what Derozio has to say about his students, and I'll come to explaining the legacy of Derozio from this poem onwards. Derozio writes, and this is the poem once again. I'm sorry, this is the poem. Listen to me if you cannot see it on your devices. Expanding like the petals of young flowers. You see, it's interesting, isn't it? How many times Derozio is using this image of the flower. We've just seen an image of the local fauna, of the flora, just wafting out into the world. But in this case, it's a different kind of an image associated with the flower. It's the flower, young bud, which is bloom. And Derozio is the agent which is leading to the young mind blooming, right? Expanding like the petals of young flowers, I watch the opening of your infant minds. Infant in the sense uninitiated, young minds, right? So Derozio, apart from being the poet prophet, right? He was the poet prophet who is ushering in Indian modernities, is also the prophetic teacher, the guru, as it were, who is opening the minds of these infant students, and the sweet loosening of the spell that binds your intellectual energies and powers, right? So Derozio is clearly articulating that there is a spell of dogma that has bound their intellectual powers, intellectual energies and powers. So young Bengal movement is a movement of opening up, of enlightening, of a sort of a revolutionary, breaking through the barriers that stretch like young birds in soft summer hours. Once again, you see, we've already seen in the Fakir of Jangira, for example, how Derozio is using this entire eagle pinion, and of course in Sati as well, the bird that flies in the sky, the flower that blooms. So within Derozio, there's a very, very significant amount of the usage of the metaphors from nature, as it were, their wings to try their strength. But these are not the eagle pinions. These are young birds, fledglings, which are trying to fly. Oh, how the winds of circumstance. So Derozio is also, if you take a critical look at that line, you'll find that Derozio is acknowledging that this is a nascent moment of Indian modernity, that together with Derozio, they are at the cusp of initiating a moment of modernity. And that is what we will look at this phase as the initial period where Western modernity interacts with Indian modernity, right? Of early knowledge and unnumbered kinds of new perceptions shed their influence. So it's like the showers of April. You have the showers of early knowledge and new perceptions shedding their influence. So it's like an influx of new ideas. Derozio is ushering in a new enlightenment. Now, obviously, you see, Bengal Renaissance has been taken as a significant word for history. I would rather call it the Bengal Enlightenment, because many of the major ideas can be traced back to the Enlightenment rather than the Renaissance, right? Of new perceptions shed their influence, and how you worship truth's omnipotence. Therefore, what Derozio is suggesting is that the God has not changed. Even in Hindu religion, the God is, after all, truth, Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. But for Derozio, the new truth that the young Bengal worships is verifiable by rationality, right? Now, if you read the essays that Derozio wrote, not the essays, rather, the letters that Derozio wrote after he was forced to resign without a trial, really, Derozio said that there are 3 charges against me. That one, I force them to shun their parents, which is not true. Secondly, I encourage incest and sodomy, which is blatantly false. And thirdly, that I'm atheist and try to convert them to Christianity, which is, again, he said, that I am a skeptic, but I'm not an atheist. I rigorously examine dogmatic practices and hold them up for reason. So the only God for Derozio is the rational God, is the God of truth, which is verifiable by reason. So there is a certain replacement of a deity, as it were. Instead of the idols of Hindu worship, Derozio is placing at the center the God of truth, right? What gladness reigns upon me. And then, as happens in romantic poetry, ultimately the poem turns towards the poet. It says, what gladness reigns upon me, carrying on this metaphor of the showers, when I see fame in the mirror of futurity. Now, it's very interesting that this poem is moving from the present, and the present as an attack on the past, and the present as also the basis for a fame in futurity. So Derozio is acknowledging the importance of his work not only in the now and the present, but he's also glimpsing into the impact that his students will have on the future of India, right? On the future of the nation. And it is therefore in this futurity that he seeks his fame and his legacy. Weaving the chaplets you are doomed to gain, and then I feel I have not lived in vain. And then it all comes back to him, the subjective romantic poet, and he suggests that I have been successful, I have lived because I will live through you, right? Through your ideas. I've circulated, germinated these ideas within you, and it is within you that my fame shall lie. Therefore, once again, carrying this, legacy both of the poet as prophet and also as the teacher, as a kind of a prophet who ushers in new realities. Talking in terms of the Guru Shishya Parampara, where the Guru keeps on living within the work of his Shishyas, right? So that sonnet, once again, talks about the flowering of the new minds, the opening up of the new ideas of the infant minds, the flying of the ideas in high space, the new knowledges which are ushered in and thrown on to the students, the presence of the omnipotent God of truth, rather than any dogmatic Hindu idol. And finally, his claim to fame and his claim to eternity and immortality through his students, right? In both these poems, you see, therefore, the romantic trait of the subjective poet intruding upon the thought process is visible. Ultimately, at the end, it all boils down to the role of the poet as well. But in doing so, Derozio has created two things. And this is what I want you to carefully note. The first thing that he has created is a new kind of a poetry that has borrowed itself from the language of the English Romantics, but has infused new realities, new sensibilities, and a new identity upon a new literature. And that literature is valid only because it has reached out to the world at large. Secondly, he has used the ideas of the English Renaissance and the English Enlightenment. Let us not call it just the English Enlightenment, but the British Enlightenment. And he has nurtured them and radiated them within his students. So it is here that you see, to the Roznigundha and to his pupils are in the same bent. It's the poet who has successfully conveyed this radiance of ideas and fragrance to society and the world at large. And this is where his claim to eternity and futurity lies. Right, a few more comments about Derozio's poetry before I move on to a discussion of his legacy. Right, now, obviously, you will understand that there were elements in the young Bengal movement which attracted a lot of negativity, that they were prone to drink, they were prone to sexualities, and they were prone to excesses of food, especially in the eating of beef and so on and so forth. So in the literature of the period, consequently, there was a variant of the young Bengal movement who was seen as the new Babu, who is anglicized, who reads Shakespeare rather than Vidyapati, who speaks English rather than Bengali, who drinks wine, who goes to prostitutes, and in generally, who is warped and completely perverted by this new modernity. So this was an interrogation of the new modernity of the period. This you find in Madhusudan, Eke Ki Bole Shobbhota, you find in Hutum Pachar Naksha, and you find it in Dinobandhu Mitro's texts as well. But having said that, there was a distinct recognition of the force through which Derozio was cutting across dogma and creating a group of young students who added significantly to the discourse of Indian modernities. Right. Now, another important aspect, and this is what Manu Chandar also asks, is what is Derozio's legacy? Is it the fact that, unlike other Anglophone poets living in India, he was born there? Or is it the trace of native ancestry of the Eurasian poet of primarily English and Portuguese descent? Now, Derozio was caught in between. He had this access to the Western literature and its conventions. He was practically living the life of an Anglo-Indian. And he also had this intimate awareness of the lives of Indian students, right? Caught in between, he identified himself as an Indian, right? And this is where the first of his legacy lies, that his poetry is the first expression of Indian writing in English, or Indian poetry in English, primarily because it triumphantly announces his Indian identity, rather than sort of apologetically seeking a Western identity, right? And you will also remember that Derozio's next major legacy lies in the fact of questioning ideas, and especially using poetry as a tool, as a very valid and urgent tool to question social dogma and certain practices, most especially against the oppression of women, as we have seen already in the Fakir of Janghira. At the same time, in poems like To His Brother in Scotland or Freedom to the Slave, Derozio has tried to unite Indian poetry being written in English with global poetries, in the sense that he suggests that the world of poetry and poets is a world which is beyond barriers, and that there is an universal brotherhood among people which needs, or which is articulated by the poet. So the poet is it that can understand the freedom of the slave, the freedom of the sati, right? And it is in this rigorous and relentless pursuit of freedom that Derozio's poems are very critical, in the sense that they also, in a certain way, accept Indian modernity, which is also cosmopolitan, right? Which is also cosmopolitan. Right. I'm stopping the sharing for the moment because, I have more or less shared the poems that I had tried to present before you. The Fakir of Janghira, of course, stands as an example, as we have seen, of a poem that is very oriental in its apparently in its approach, but working within that oriental tradition, Derozio has successfully problematized it by incorporating an insider's perspective, using concepts, local floras and faunas, and thereby imbuing within an oriental tale a local Indian feeling. But more importantly, what he has done is he has problematized the entire question and the misery of the Indian widow and the Indian woman. Therefore, taking the oriental tale of the Fakir of Janghira, Derozio has made this poem as a poem about Nalini, right? Now, the other thing that I would like to talk about is this entire question about language. So Derozio's poems are all social commentaries in a certain way, but it is in his language that Derozio still remains primarily locked within the discourses of Orientalism and European Romanticism. There's as yet no significant breakthrough apart from the incorporation of Indian concepts and local realities. There's no significant breakthrough in breaking open the modes and genres of poetry, or the greater problematization of the lyric. Now that, I think, will come once, Indian poetry steps into the modern phase. The other thing which we do not locate within Derozio is any significant sense of irony. Now, but irony once again comes through maturity. So Derozio being dead at 22, the ironic representation of the British, the critique of the imperial British Raj, as it were, is still absent in Derozio. Is it because of his usage of the predominant Western tradition? Is it because of his identity as an Anglo-Indian? Would Derozio have sort of protested against the English rule at large had he had more time? Is its exhortations to freedom largely restricted to what we'll call abstract concepts against sati, against the practice of slavery, and not directed particularly towards the British practices? Would that have changed with time? Now, this is where I come back to Derozio's legacy and the importance of the rise of the Young Bengal movement, as it were. Now, if you take a look at the Young Bengal movement, then what were the features? And these are things which I had clarified in the first class. Let me reiterate them now. The first is an absolute dedication to truth and rationality. So it is only true if it is rationally verifiable, right? The more political demands stood for the general protection of rights and promotion of general social utility and equality. As I had pointed out, Tom Paine's Rights of Man became an important text for the Young Bengal movement, leading to the British becoming extremely anxious because they thought that it was one of the most radical anti-governmental treatises and could foment a lot of unrest. Very important to the Derosians was the promotion of education through Hindu society, including its women. Now, this is where you will find the two Derosians, and I will talk about their contribution, were instrumental in helping Bethune set up the Bethune College for Women, even donating land for the purpose. So the Derosians, one of the major premises of the Derosian brotherhood, of the band of brothers that Derozio gathered around themselves, was this promotion of education, and especially women, improving the women's lot, right? Very important, many of the Derosians would, and this is where the legacy of Derozio lies, talk about the importance of Indians within the governmental setup of the East India Company and the British rule. So persistently within the Derosians, we see a demand for Indian representation within the governmental setup and the political setup. So the first real movements towards Indian, if not independence, but Indian sovereignty to a certain extent, lies in many of the Derosians of the period. Derozio was also talking about more indigenous appointments in government service. Many of the Derosians went into government service, and also, very importantly, the space for interaction between Europeans and Indians at large in a forum of equal debate. It is this feature of Derozio which I think is very important, that he was seeking the East Indian, the Indian, and the European as equal, as a band of brothers who could debate issues and correct society if necessary. Also important in Derozio is the internal critique that he pointed towards Hindu society. Now, he was, of course, not internal to Hindu society, but many of the Derosians who were part of Hindu college were intrinsic parts of Hindu society. and they looked very critically at the dogmatic practices, in many cases breaking free from the shackles. And therefore, was it quite natural that many of them, in the absence of Derozio's presence and the fizzling out of the Young Bengal movement, would in their middle ages turn towards the other movement which was trying to overhaul the Hindu system, and that is the Brahmo movement, right? So Derozio's students went into public service, distinguished themselves as educationists, and participated in the internal critique of Hindu society, and therefore were largely instrumental or equally participatory in the ushering in of the Bengal Renaissance. Right. Now, who are these people that I am talking about? Take somebody like Perichand Mitra, for example. Now, Perichand Mitra, of course, you know him in his for his unique Bengali prose style in Alaler Ghare Dulal. Perichand Mitra was incidentally instrumental in introducing the Cholit Bhasha into the literary discourse. Now, this was not just Perichand Mitra alone, but a lot of people were doing so, but he was equally instrumental. Perichand Mitra is important because of his essay on the Jomindar and the Riot, the Jomidar and the Riot, right? The Riot being the Proja, as it were, the Borgadar, as it were, right? And he was talking about in this particular treatise about peasant rights. And Mitra writes that the idea of property as being the product of labor is natural with man. Land unclaimed from sterility is common property. It is the first tillage and cultivation which constitutes private property. And therefore, Mitra was writing against the zamindars and who were alien to the internal economy and who compound exorbitant rates with illegal cess taxes, complemented by a class of moneylenders preying on the hand-to-mouth existence of the cultivators. Now, this is something which came up in the last class. One of you had asked whether Derozio's compatriots and Derozio's Young Bengal movement was turning a blind eye to the cause of peasants. Now, here is a Derozian who's actually writing about it and the individual right of the farmer and the greater freedom of him to till his land. Now, it's true that Derozio himself never wrote about farmers or the riots in general, but we'll have to take into cognizance that Derozio was talking about individual freedom and rights, and therefore it was natural that some of the Derozians would move in and gravitate towards this direction. I would say that the legacy of Derozio lay in his opening up of this entire discourse of politics, religion, and the domestic sphere, of what you eat, what you drink, how you practice religion, and how you practice your politics. He was opening all this up in the minds of his poet. Right. Now, very interestingly, you will find that a lot of people of the Derozians were contributing to women's education. Harimohan Chattopadhyay, for example, was one of the major writers of the period who talked about the Derozians continually debating the practices of dogmatism within Hindu society. Very interestingly, like Derozio, almost all of his students initiated print magazines. Right, this is another very important aspect, that Derozio initiated a new resurgence in the print sphere, in the print public sphere, articulating through prose magazines the various ideas of the period. Very importantly, Radhanath Shikdar, for example, the Mashik Potrika, targeting women readers of the time, and talked about women's empowerment, Harachandra Ghosh and Ram Gopal Ghosh were two important figures in the sense that they helped Bethune set up the first Asian college for women, that is Bethune College. And another major figure, Dakshinaranjan Mukherjee, who was this radical Derosian who threw beef into houses of people. He was instrumental in donating land on which today the Bethune College stands. Another Derosian, Shib Chandra Deb, opened a girls' school in his own house, which was soon shifted to the neighboring building. But you see, the commitment of the Derosians to both education and the cause of women, something we've already seen in Derozio's poetry. A major figure, of course, being Krishna Mohan Banerjee, I'm sorry, educationist, literator, and author. Very importantly, also a major figure who campaigned. He was one of the few Derosians to have actually converted to Christianity and campaigned against Hindu social ills. I've already sort of talked about Shib Chandra Deb. Shib Chandra Deb incidentally went on to become joined the British Survey Department, becoming an important part of the Brahmo Samaj, and conducted his son's marriage without Brahmin threads, priests, and the sacred fire. So he was initiating the system of marriage without the Joggo, as it were, and which created considerable furor in India, in contemporary Bengali society. Harachandra Ghosh, another Derosian, went on to become a judge of the Calcutta Small Causes Court and talked about reforms in the Indian Penal Code, which were quite landmark. Ram Gopal Ghosh, son of a small shopkeeper who flowered with education provided at Hindu College, was known as the Indian Demosthenes, and he suggested and he practically declared that he would renounce Hinduism if it fell short of his rational expectations. Many of you have heard about Ramtanu Lahiri, about whom Shibnath Shastri writes. Ramtanu Lahiri was a major teacher and social reformer of this period and renounced his poite, or the sacred thread, under the influence of Derozio. Roshik Krishna Mollik, another major publisher of the period, started newspapers and a free school for women. And of course, Perichand Mitro, major author. Dakshinaranjan Mukherjee, another major author and the first to be appointed as a collector in the Calcutta municipality, became a major practicing lawyer and pleaded for the equality of Indians in public service along with Europeans. Finally, the one man whom all of you have known about, Radhanath Chigdar, another major mathematician, geologist, who along with Everest sort of measured the height of Mount Everest. Incidentally, it was Everest who had the claim to the name of the mountain, but Radhanath Chigdar's trigonometric skills were no less important. What I'm therefore looking at is a group of extraordinarily bright people assembling around Derozio, fired up by his commitment towards individual freedom, political freedom, women's emancipation, the importance of education, and the rigorous and violent, zealous questioning of Hindu dogmatic practices. In their zeal to question, they often went overboard. And many people claiming to be Derosians actually started living a life of bohemian excess. But if you look at the core group of people who assembled around Derozio, we see a very strong legacy emerging. We see a legacy where they critically studied European Enlightenment texts, including David Hume, Thomas Paine, and also the literature of the period. Shelley, Keats, Byron, earlier Shakespeare, and we're bringing in a new cosmopolitan modernity within Indian society. This is that first moment within Indian modernity where we see a very strong group of Indian intellectuals as a group engaging with Western Enlightenment ideas and literature and trying to implement or trying to come into a conflict with the conventional dogmatic practices and literatures of that period. And it is out of this conflict that is born the poetry of Derozio and the subsequent work of the Young Bengal movement. The Young Bengal movement fizzled out. There's no doubt about it. It was extremely, it spanned a very small period of time. But its importance lay not in the fact of what it achieved at that point of time. Its achievement lay in what it achieved subsequently through these students, many of whom entered into public service, the Brahmo Samaj, and gave a significant impetus to the case of Indian nationalism and the dignity of the Indian civil servant, to, more importantly, the reformation of Hindu society, and especially the upliftment of education and women's emancipation and education. And thirdly, in the creation of a vibrant Indian public print sphere that would become critical in the rise of an Indian nationalism. If you think about Hindu militant nationalism, Derozio was not its founding father. He was rather the founding father of an Indian identity that would very strongly use local, and announce its local moorings while accepting and trying to adjust with the Western modernist practices that were entering Hindu society. Derozio was a poet of his time. He could not have been possible without India's encounter with the West. But Derozio was the most potent of the early encounter of India with the West, claiming for himself an Indian identity while borrowing from the literary traditions of the West, claiming an Indian salient space while borrowing from many of the ideas of the European Enlightenment, and radiating, this is his most important contribution, radiating it to a group of Indian students, Indian Hindu students, who would then radiate it further through the Bengal Renaissance. Now, it is very difficult to say that Derozio's legacy is the Bengal Renaissance. No, it's difficult to say that. There were other streams of thought that came into the making of the Bengal Renaissance, Raja Ram Mohan's modernity being significantly different from Derozio's. But it cannot be denied that one of the major influences of the Bengal Renaissance, of Indian modernity, came through the work and of Derozio and his students. When it comes to poetry, Indian poetry in English, I would say Derozio stands at its forefront primarily because he talked about an Indian identity, Indian local realities. He attempted, and largely at this point of time, English literature was foreign literature, to bring this alien idiom within the Indian realities. His Indian poetry might have been largely romantic, oriental, and used the tropes of the contemporary romantic tradition. But within the space, Derozio was seeking to create the innovation of the local, even if the poetic language and the idiom was not disturbed, the realities that he was trying to talk about, the cosmopolitanism and the internationalism that he was trying to claim for Indian poetry, and the strong identification with his Indian identity makes him one of the first important poets of, or the first important poet of the canon of Indian writing in English. Now, reading in 2020, Derozio seems as alien as Keats. But we will need to take into cognizance that Indian poetry has traveled almost 200 years. And it is within these first years that Derozio's three important aspects need to be critically looked at. One, his claim that he was an Indian and that his realities need to be represented in his poetry, even if it be in the Western idiom, is very important. Two, his grappling with poetry as a kind of an agent that would try and tackle social issues. And the role of the poet remains a very important romantic idea that would center around Indian, that would be the fulcrum of Indian poetry for the next 100 years. Thirdly, Derozio was problematizing issues of language and idiom as well. How could local realities be expressed in a language which was alien? How could a salient language of Indian poetry emerge, given that it was so heavily dominated by Western tropes? And what would be the subject matter of Indian poetry in English? Who would be receiving it? Who would be its readership? Was it going to cater only to a local segment of the audience? Or was it to be radiated to a larger global fraternity? Now, having seen Indian diasporic literature and its popularity in the West, and its gradual encroachment into Western syllabi, especially the post-colonial papers, we see Derozio as a poet who stood at a cusp of Indian modernity, looking forward into a territory that was largely fallow. He had nothing in front of him, no models. He was by and large creating his own model, but the questions that he was asking, what is Indian about Indian poetry in English? How much of the English is there in Indian poetry in English? And how does one resolve this issue? And who are the readers of Indian poetry in English? And how it can emerge as a salient body of literature in its own right are issues that were pondered by Derozio, problematized by Derozio in a very, very brief poetic career. And these are questions that remain very central to you too, when you, those of you who will take up this paper, and those of you who will sift through Torudat, who will sift through Ramanujan, Kamala Das. All these poets have never stopped responding to the questions that Derozio had very subtly posed within his poetry. Apart from this, apart from his poetic output, there is, of course, Derozio as one of the founding fathers of Indian modernity. And this legacy also makes him such a very radical, such a very enigmatic character. 22 years and a few months Derozio lived. But the poetry and the legacy that he has left behind is still something that we are debating in 2020. It is with these comments that I'd like to stop the recording, and once that is done, I'll take your questions.